Russia has a problem. It's not a problem that's going to rear its head for as long as the Ukraine war rages. It's going to come after, when hundreds of thousands of soldiers that Vladimir Putin has sent to fight in Ukraine start streaming back home. Chaos will ensue. The Kremlin is barreling headlong into a crisis, and it's too late to do anything about it. Russia's war veterans will turn against Putin, Russia, and the very order of the country when the Ukraine war ends. That's according to the Kyiv Post, which published an interesting piece written by Antonia Langford that claims many in the Kremlin, including Putin himself, are worried about what will happen to Russia after the war ends. However the invasion concludes, the one certain thing is that hundreds of thousands of veterans of one of the most brutal and bloody conflicts of recent times will return to a nation where they are expected to act in a certain way. These are soldiers who have been trained to inflict a special brand of brutality against their Ukrainian enemies, along with having seen the violence inflicted against their comrades for months or in some cases years at a time. Social upheaval caused by these soldiers is on the Kremlin's collective mind. At least that's according to 3 unnamed sources that have ties to Russia's political elite, all of whom tell Langford that Russia needs to be ready for what comes after the war. First on the agenda, avoiding the sort of issues that arose in the wake of Russia's war with Afghanistan. One of the sources said that Moscow is particularly focused on avoiding a repeat of the post-Afghanistan experience, when demobilized veterans played a significant role in the rise of organized crime during the turbulent 1990s, Langford writes. The turbulent 1990s is one way to put it. A more accurate way would be to say that the post-Afghan era was a horror show for Russia. The decade after Russia's war with Afghanistan saw former soldiers stream back into Russia and almost immediately settle into lives of crime, where the violence that had become part of their nature could serve a purpose. This wasn't aided by Russia's complete inability to care for those returning soldiers, as the Christian Science Monitor said all the way back in October 2000. Alcoholism, drug abuse, and lives of organized crime became the norms for many of Russia's returning soldiers, as the Afghanistan war warped many veterans' views of what civilian life was. Those soldiers had no real support networks to help them transition. Worse yet, many were treated poorly by the people for whom they'd fought, due to many in Russia thinking negatively about the Afghanistan war in a similar way to how many in the US viewed the Vietnam War. They were absolutely neglected by the state, and the result is Afghansky syndrome, just like the Vietnam syndrome, a retired Major General named Vladimir Kosarev once said. What is a former soldier to do when their own society rejects them? Turn to a life of crime. In 2018, The Guardian published a report detailing the rise of organized crime in Russia that occurred following the end of the Afghanistan war and the collapse of the Soviet Union. As the values and structures of Soviet life crumbled and fell, organized crime was emerging from the ruins, no longer subservient to the corrupt Communist Party bosses and the black market millionaires, The Guardian wrote. As it rose, it was gathering a new generation of recruits, including damaged and disillusioned veterans of the USSR's last war. Some were bodyguards, some were runners, some were leg breakers, and some, such as Volodya, were killers. The Volodya referred to here is the man that The Guardian's reporters spoke to, who said that he ended up becoming a torpedo, which was the term used in Russian crime circles of the 1990s to refer to a hitman. At a time when the average Russian wage was about $1 per day, returning soldiers could earn thousands, even millions of dollars by turning their skills toward crime. Fast forward to today, and many inside the Kremlin worry something similar could happen again. Russia is a very different beast from what it was in the 1990s, when the entire country was undergoing an upheaval upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin exercises far more control than was seen from the political elite of that time, though even he would have to admit that there are far too many cases of returning Ukraine war veterans turning to lives of crime. Langford highlights this in her piece for the Kyiv Post, pointing to the case of Azamat Asgaliev. In October 2024, the 35-year-old convict who was given the choice between jail and fighting after stabbing his wife to death in 2021 returned home after 6 months on the Ukrainian battlefield. The already violent Asgaliev repeated the actions that had gotten him sent to Ukraine in the first place, this time stabbing his girlfriend to death. That shocking case took place in a month when Vertstka reported that around 500 Russian civilians had become victims of violent crimes perpetrated by Russia's Ukraine war veterans. 242 of those people had been murdered. You don't have to look far to find many more reports of Russian veterans bringing violence and crime back home. In November 2024, the BBC reported on a woman named Irina, who was attacked by a veteran who yelled the words, "I'm a veteran of the special military operation. I'm going to kill you." She was then kicked and beaten with the man's crutch, though she survived. The man was so confident in his assault that he showed a document supposedly proving he'd served in Ukraine while proclaiming that nothing would happen to him over the assault. According to Defense 24, the first half of 2025 saw Russia record 333,251 serious and particularly serious crimes, which represented a 10.4% increase over the figure from the same period in 2024, and was the highest half-year total Russia had seen in 15 years. These violent crimes are rising, even as the overall Russian crime rate is on the decline, the outlet says. Many of these types of crimes are being linked to Russia's veterans. There is a very clear pattern emerging here. And though it's different from the post-Afghan war era, where many of those who returned ended up in organized crime, there are signs that something is brewing. Today, it's random acts of violence. Once the Ukraine war ends and hundreds of thousands of soldiers come back to Russia, there is a chance that something far more organized could occur. But we'll come back to that point in a moment. What we also can't ignore is the fact that many of those serving in the Russian military are already convicted criminals. Azamat Iskaliev was just one example. According to a September 9th report from the Moscow Times, anywhere between 120,000 and 180,000 of Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine are convicts who have traded their sentences for 6 months of Ukraine war service as part of a 2023 program created by Russia's Ministry of Defense. We can just see how heavily Russia is relying on convicts to fight Putin's war in Russia's prison statistics, the Kyiv Independent said in January. In 2024, there were between 300,000 and 350,000 Russians serving time. While that may seem like a lot, it's about half the number that were serving time in 2014. The decline isn't necessarily because significantly fewer crimes are being committed. It's happening because hundreds of thousands of convicts are being sent to fight. Think about what that means for Russia's future. It's recruiting soldiers who have already shown a propensity for criminality, which could range from small-scale crimes like theft through to severe acts of violence up to and including murder. In Ukraine, these criminals are being trained to become killing machines, and they're seeing violence inflicted by and upon them daily. Not all of the 180,000 or so convicts who have been sent to Ukraine will come back, but many will, and these criminals will be allowed to re-enter society with a new set of skills and possibly even more warped mindsets than they had before they entered Ukraine. Now consider this. The Ukraine war is a far larger conflict than the Afghanistan war in terms of the number of soldiers Russia has committed to the fight. The Encyclopedia Britannica says that around 100,000 Soviet soldiers served in Afghanistan, which is far less than the number of convicts serving in Ukraine, never mind the total number of soldiers Russia has sent. American Archive also notes that the Afghanistan conflict was far less damaging to Russia than the Ukraine war has been. Over the course of about a decade, 15,000 Soviet soldiers lost their lives. In less than 4 years of fighting, Russia has experienced over 1.09 million casualties, Ukraine's Ministry of Finance reports. The disparity in numbers here is massive. If what happened after Afghanistan led to a crisis caused by 100,000 or so veterans returning home, what on earth does it mean for Russia when many times that number will be returning or have already returned following the Ukraine war? The influx that led to a surge in violence and gangsterism in the 1990s will be dwarfed by what Russia faces when it brings its troops home at any point from today onward. The Kremlin is worried, and it's right to be. After all, it's not just the influx of veterans surging back into Russia that's a problem. Another issue emerges because those veterans have gotten used to a standard of pay that simply isn't typical of the average Russian experience. Langford says that the same source who told her of Kremlin concerns that the post-Afghanistan crisis could be repeated also highlighted the salary situation. The same source voiced concerns that many of those returning to civilian life will have to adjust to radically lower salaries than those they've been receiving from Putin's war chest, which could also foster discontent, Langford writes. Again, discontent seems like a subdued term. The sheer difference in salaries earned could lead many veterans down the criminal path that the Kremlin so fears. Right now, Langford says, a Russian military recruit is paid, on average, $62,000 for their first year of service. If that recruit both survives and works their way up the ranks, their income could increase dramatically. Plus, these recruits receive one-time signing-on bonuses that averaged about $15,500 across 37 Russian regions back in April, per the Moscow Times. Those bonuses aren't subject to tax, meaning it's all money that Russian soldiers get to pocket. The average Russian wage is nowhere near these numbers. Though wages in Russia are on the rise and are expected to increase by 12% in 2025 alone, they're still low in comparison to a soldier's wage. Trading Economics says that the average Russian salary was 103,183 rubles per month in June 2025, which translates to 1,238,196 rubles per year. That translates to a measly $14,653.13, which isn't even high enough to touch the signing-on bonuses that a Russian soldier receives, never mind their annual wage. A first-year soldier earns over 4 times the average Russian wage, regardless of their experience level or past convictions. Of course, many Russian veterans will see the Ukraine war as an opportunity to make a lot of money very quickly for risking their lives. Perhaps they'll slide back into civilian life with their windfalls saved. But the Kremlin worries that many of its soldiers will have gotten so used to the pay they earn in the military, they won't want to go back to wages that are 4 times lower. Some will stick with the army after the Ukraine war ends, though it's unlikely that they'll be paid anything close to what they're being paid right now. Russia won't need to spend through the nose when there isn't an active war going on. However, there will be some. Nobody knows how many, but some of Russia's soldiers will want to do whatever it takes to keep earning the kind of money they earn while fighting for Putin. That sort of money isn't available for the average Russian, so it's not a huge leap to say that many of Russia's returning soldiers, a large portion of whom are already criminals, will turn to crime to keep the cash rolling in. Or worse yet for Russia, the returning Ukraine war veterans might come home angry. So angry that they decide to mobilize into paramilitary units that could cause problems for the Kremlin and the entire Russian social order. Langford writes, a second source close to the Kremlin told Reuters the Russian government fears the impact that a mass veteran return might have on its tight grip over the political system, pointing to the chaos unleashed by Wagner mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin's 2023 mutiny against the military top brass. Joining or forming a mercenary group like Wagner seems like one of the few career paths open to returning Russian soldiers that would allow them to use the skills they've developed and might pay them something close to what they're receiving from the Kremlin. However, as Langford's source notes, you only need to look at the Wagner incident to see why that could be a problem for Russia. On June 24, 2023, a large group of Wagner mercenaries, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, began marching from the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. They weren't heading into Ukraine, rather they were marching on Moscow. Along the way, the group claimed control over several Russian military facilities, ABC News reports. Prigozhin had delivered a warning to Putin before the march. There are 25,000 of us, and we are coming to sort things out. Those who want to join us, it's time to finish with this mess, Prigozhin had said. Wagner's leader had been contemplating a mutiny like this for some time, as revealed by a series of online rants in which he attacked Putin for the treatment of his soldiers during the Ukraine war. The march he organized ended up being the single largest challenge that Putin has faced to his leadership since he rose to power in 2000, though it ended almost as quickly as it started. Within 24 hours, Prigozhin ordered his mercenaries to turn back, and things seemed to have been smoothed over between Wagner and the Kremlin. A couple of months later, Prigozhin was dead, the victim of a plane crash that has the Kremlin's fingerprints all over it. Coming back to our earlier point about a lot of angry veterans entering Russia, is it outside the realm of possibility to think that something similar to the Wagner incident could happen again? What if thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of veterans, angered by a lack of pay, fueled by their own violent tendencies, and organized enough to create a new militia, marched on the Kremlin? Those are questions that Langford's sources say are now being asked by Russia's political elite, and the worst-case scenario looks grim for Putin. At its peak, the Wagner group was believed to have about 50,000 soldiers, about 40,000 of whom were convicts who had been employed from Russia's prisons. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? The Russian military had upward of 640,000 soldiers fighting in Ukraine as of May 2025. The Kyiv Independent reports, and we already know that as many as 180,000 of those are convicts. None of this is counting the hundreds of thousands of Russians who have already served, only to be forced home by injury. There are parallels to be drawn here, and the sheer size of the group that will return home after the Ukraine war is making the Kremlin worried. It might only take a few mutineers to lead tens of thousands of Russia's soldiers into a rebellion. If that rebellion isn't resolved quietly, as the Wagner March was, neither scenario looks good for Putin. Either he has to turn Russia's military on the very people who fought for that military in Ukraine, or he gets overthrown, along with the entire social structure that he created inside Russia. There are a lot of what-ifs in this scenario, but Langford isn't saying that all of these things are definitely going to happen. She says that her sources close to the Kremlin say that these are concerns that are currently being expressed by Russia's political elite. The invasion that Putin started could wind up coming back to bite him, whether Russia wins, loses, or draws in Ukraine. So what is Russia doing to try to get ahead of the problem? It has a few tricks up its sleeve. Langford says that Russia's Central Election Commission reports that 1,600 veterans have been nominated as candidates for regional and local elections in 2025. That's one way for Putin to buy some loyalty, promising those who fought for him in Ukraine some measure of political power, along with the money and potential to take as many bribes as they want. Could simmer down some tensions, but this is 1,600 people out of a military of hundreds of thousands, and there aren't enough political positions to go around for everybody who'll be coming back from Ukraine. Russia's A Time of Heroes program is also supposed to help returning veterans adapt to civilian life after experiencing the horrors of the war. That program is supposed to provide training to those selected for it, and any current or past service member who has served in the Ukraine war can apply. However, there is a problem with this program that shows us it isn't capable of doing anywhere near enough to counter the challenges that many in the Kremlin believe lie in Russia's future. A Time of Heroes being positioned as an elite scheme is that problem. In December 2024, Novaya Gazeta wrote that around 44,000 of Russia's former soldiers had applied to A Time of Heroes. Of those 44,000, 83 were selected to take part, representing a dismal acceptance rate of 0.1%. Those candidates will go on to take part in a bespoke master's degree program designed to help them get good jobs in civilian life. As for the other 43,917, who knows? They've been rejected from a program supposedly designed to help them, which might end up fueling the kind of anger that gives rise to violence and insurrections. So far, the solutions that Russia is coming up with have helped fewer than 1,700 veterans. That's a paltry amount compared to the sheer number of people who've served Russia in Ukraine. Either this means that Russia doesn't have the resources needed to support its returning soldiers, or it doesn't have the inclination. Either way, there are more parallels. Cast your mind back to the beginning of the video, and the point we made about how Russian soldiers returning from Afghanistan had no real support network. We're seeing that all over again in modern-day Russia. Sure, there is a hint of a network, but it's one that only serves a fraction of a percent of Russia's soldiers that have served in Ukraine, which is so few that the programs and political rewards Russia has created may as well not exist for most. Russia will be left with the battle-scarred and angry veterans coming back home to a place where they're paid far less than they've grown accustomed to and where their skills make them ideal candidates for criminality. There will be hundreds of thousands of these veterans. Putin could end up losing control of Russia as a result of the very military that he created. Speaking about losing control, Putin's grip on the annexed Crimean peninsula is starting to slip too, and it's happening thanks to a brilliant two-pronged Ukrainian strategy that may result in the Russians living in Crimea evacuating of their own accord. Find out more in our video, De-Russification of Crimea begins now, Russians flee in droves. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the crumbling state of Russia's social systems. And thank you, as always, for watching.